The house on Blackwood Lane. It was a dark and stormy night when the Wilson family arrived at the house on Blackwood Lane. They had been driving for hours and were relieved to finally have arrived at their destination. But as they approached the house, they couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. The house was old and imposing, with ivy creeping up the sides and a dark, foreboding presence that seemed to emanate from its very walls. As they stepped inside, they were hit with the musty smell of age and neglect. The Wilsons had moved to this house in the hopes of starting a new life after a series of tragedies and setbacks had left them feeling adrift. But from the moment they arrived, they knew that something was not right. Strange noises echoed through the halls at night, and there were cold spots that seemed to follow them from room to room. As the weeks went by, the family became more and more isolated. The phone lines were dead, and the roads leading to the house had been washed out in a recent storm. They were trapped, with no way to escape the growing sense of dread that had taken hold of them. One night, as they sat in the dim light of the flickering candles, they heard a loud banging at the door. They cautiously opened it to reveal a figure standing on the porch, dressed in old-fashioned clothing and looking as if they had stepped out of another era. The figure spoke in a language they did not understand, and before they could react, it disappeared into the darkness. From that night on, the house on Blackwood Lane was no longer their home. They were merely tenants in a place that belonged to something much darker and more malevolent. As the days passed, the family members began to disappear one by one, their bodies never found. In the end, only one member remained, the youngest daughter. She sat alone in the darkness, listening to the creaking of the house and the whispering voices that seemed to come from nowhere. And then, one night, she too disappeared, leaving behind only the sound of her terrified screams. The house on Blackwood Lane remained silent and still, a monument to the horrors that lay within its walls, waiting for the next unsuspecting family to fall under its spell. There was once a group of 4 women who decided to go on a camping trip in a dense forest. They were all excited about the adventure and had prepared for weeks for the trip. They arrived at the campsite and set up their tents, excited about the adventure that lay ahead. The first night went smoothly, and the women enjoyed sitting around the campfire and telling ghost stories. However, the second day was not as pleasant. They decided to go on a hike, but somehow they lost their way and couldn't find the trail that would lead them back to their campsite. As they walked deeper into the forest, they began to notice that something was not quite right. The birds had stopped chirping, and the only sounds they could hear were their own footsteps and the rustling of leaves under their feet. The air grew colder, and the trees became taller, casting a long, eerie shadow over the group. They soon realized that they were completely lost and had no idea how to get back to their campsite. They decided to set up a makeshift camp for the night and continue their search for the trail in the morning. As they sat around the campfire, they noticed strange noises coming from the woods. It sounded like footsteps, but no one was there. Suddenly, one of the women screamed, and they all turned to see what had frightened her. In the darkness, they saw a pair of glowing eyes staring back at them. They could not tell what it was, but they all knew that it was not human. The women huddled together, terrified, as they heard more noises coming from the woods. They could hear twigs snapping and leaves rustling, and they knew that something was watching them. They tried to calm each other down and convince themselves that it was just an animal. But deep down, They knew that it was something far more sinister. As the night wore on, the women began to experience strange things. One of them felt a cold hand touching her shoulder, but when she turned around, no one was there. Another one heard a voice whispering her name, but when she looked around, she saw nothing but darkness. The women were trapped in the woods, and they knew that something was after them. They could feel its presence all around them, watching their every move. They huddled together, praying for dawn to break so they could make a run for it. When morning finally arrived, the women gathered their things and started walking. They didn't know which way to go, but they kept moving, hoping that they would eventually find their way back to civilization. After hours of walking, they stumbled upon an abandoned cabin. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, but they decided to take shelter there until they could figure out what to do next. As they entered the cabin, they realized that they were not alone. The air was thick with a foul smell, and they could hear something moving around in the darkness. They tried to leave, but the door wouldn't budge. They were trapped, with no way out. The women never made it out of the woods. Their bodies were never found, and their fate remains a mystery to this day. Some say that they were attacked by a group of wild animals, while others believe that they were taken by something far more sinister, something that lurks in the shadows of the forest, waiting for its next victim. Sarah was an experienced hiker who loved to explore the wilderness. She had hiked many trails in her life, but this time, she decided to take on a new challenge. She planned to hike a remote trail in a dense forest that was known for its rugged terrain and unpredictable weather. She packed her gear and set out on the journey, feeling excited and confident. The first few days went smoothly, and Sarah enjoyed the breathtaking views and the serenity of the forest. But on the third day, she lost her way. She had followed a trail that seemed to lead to a dead end, and when she tried to backtrack, she realized that she had strayed too far from the main path. She tried to retrace her steps, but the forest looked unfamiliar, and the trees seemed to blend together. The sun was setting, and Sarah knew that she had to find shelter before nightfall. She looked around and saw a small cabin in the distance. She hurried towards it, hoping to find refuge for the night. As she approached the cabin, she noticed that it looked old and abandoned. The windows were broken, and the door hung on its hinges. Sarah hesitated, but the sound of thunder in the distance made her decision for her. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The cabin was small and musty, and Sarah could barely see anything in the darkness. She tried to light a match, but the wind blew it out. She sat down on the floor, feeling scared and alone. Suddenly, she heard a noise outside. It sounded like footsteps, and they seemed to be getting closer. Sarah's heart started pounding, and she tried to control her breathing. She heard the doorknob turning, and she knew that someone or something was trying to get in. The door creaked open, and a figure entered the cabin. Sarah could not see who it was, but she could feel its presence. The figure walked towards her and stood over her. Sarah could hear its breathing, and it sounded labored and heavy. She tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. The figure reached down and touched her face. Its touch was cold and clammy, and Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. She could not move, and she felt paralyzed with fear. Suddenly, a bolt of lightning illuminated the cabin, and Sarah saw the figure's face. It was a woman, but she looked like she had been dead for years. Her skin was gray and leathery, and her eyes were sunken and empty. Sarah screamed, and the woman disappeared. She was alone in the cabin, but she could still feel the woman's presence. She knew that she had to get out of there before something worse happened. She ran out of the cabin and started running through the forest, hoping to find her way back to civilization. But the forest seemed to have a life of its own, and it kept leading her in circles. Sarah knew that she was lost, and she felt like she would never escape the forest's grip. Days turned into weeks, and Sarah never made it out of the forest. Her body was found by a search party, weeks after she had disappeared. Her face was twisted in terror, and her eyes were open wide, as if she had seen something too horrible to describe. The locals say that Sarah had been cursed by the forest, and that the woman she had seen was the ghost of a woman who had died in the forest years ago. They say that the forest has a way of keeping its secrets, and that those who wander too far into its depths will never return. It was a typical Saturday night, and the Johnson family had plans to go out for dinner and a movie. Their two young children, Tommy and Jenny, were excited for their parents to leave so they could have the house to themselves. The parents reminded them of the rules and left, promising to be back by midnight. As soon as the parents drove away, Tommy and Jenny ran to the living room and turned on the TV. They made popcorn and settled in for a night of fun. But as they watched TV, they heard strange noises coming from upstairs. They tried to ignore it, thinking it was just the house settling, but the noises continued to get louder. Suddenly, the power went out. Tommy and Jenny were left in total darkness, and they started to panic. They grabbed flashlights and searched the house, but they couldn't find anything that would explain the power outage. They tried to call their parents, but their phones were dead. The noises from upstairs continued, and they sounded like footsteps. Tommy and Jenny were too scared to investigate, so they huddled together in the living room. They tried to keep each other calm, but their imaginations started to run wild. After what felt like hours, they heard a knock at the front door. Tommy cautiously walked over and looked through the peephole. He saw a man standing on the porch, but he didn't recognize him. The man asked to come in, saying that he needed help. Tommy and Jenny were hesitant, but they didn't know what else to do. They opened the door, and the man came inside. He looked disheveled and smelled bad, but he seemed harmless. He said that his car had broken down and that he needed to call for help. Tommy offered to let him use the phone, and the man thanked him. But as soon as he picked up the phone, he started to laugh maniacally. Tommy and Jenny were terrified, and they tried to run out of the house, but the man blocked their way. The man revealed that he had been watching the family for weeks, and that he had been waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. He said that he had killed their parents, and that he was going to kill Tommy and Jenny too. Tommy and Jenny screamed and fought back, but the man was too strong. He overpowered them and tied them up in the basement. He said that he was going to keep them there until they died, and that no one would ever find them. Days turned into weeks, and Tommy and Jenny were trapped in the basement with no hope of escape. They cried themselves to sleep every night, wondering if they would ever see daylight again. They knew that they were alone and that no one was coming to save them. The police eventually found the man and arrested him, but it was too late for the Johnson family. The parents had been killed, and Tommy and Jenny had been traumatized for life. They never forgot the night that they were left alone, and they never felt safe in their own home again. It was the summer of 1999, and Emily had just graduated from college. She was excited to start her new job in a different city, and she decided to take a road trip to celebrate her newfound freedom. She packed her car and set out on the open road. Eager for adventure, she drove for hours, admiring the changing landscapes and listening to her favorite music. But as the sun started to set, she realized that she hadn't made any plans for where she would spend the night. She checked her map and found a small town a few miles away. She decided to stop there for the night and find a motel. The town was small and quiet, and Emily found a cheap motel on the outskirts. It looked run down, but she was too tired to care. She checked in and went to her room. It was small and dingy, but she didn't mind. She was just happy to have a bed to sleep in. As she was getting ready for bed, she noticed that the door to the adjoining room was slightly ajar. She assumed that it was just a cleaning person or another guest who had forgotten to close it all the way. She pushed the door shut and went to sleep. In the middle of the night, Emily was awakened by strange noises coming from the adjoining room. She tried to ignore it and go back to sleep, but the noises continued. She got up and went to the door, but she was afraid to open it. She put her ear to the door and listened. She heard muffled voices and the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. Emily was terrified, but she didn't know what to do. She considered calling the police, but she didn't want to overreact. She decided to try to get some sleep and leave the motel in the morning. The next morning, Emily checked out of the motel and drove away as fast as she could. She felt relieved to be on the open road again, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She drove for a few more hours before stopping for lunch at a roadside diner. As she was eating, she saw a news report on TV about a serial killer who had been operating in the area. The report showed a picture of the killer, and Emily felt sick to her stomach. The man in the picture was the same man she had seen at the motel. Emily panicked and tried to leave the diner, but the door was locked. She looked around and realized that all the customers were staring at her, with blank expressions on their faces. She tried to run, but she felt paralyzed. She realized that she was trapped in a nightmare, and there was no way out. Emily woke up, drenched in sweat. It had all been a dream. She laughed at herself for being so paranoid and went back to sleep. But the next morning, she read a news report about a serial killer who had been operating in the same area where she had stayed at the motel. The killer had been arrested, but Emily knew that she would never forget the terror she had experienced that night.